everyone. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar. My name is Anderson Lunsford, and I'm the founder and CEO of BreachRx, the leading privacy incident management platform. I'm an attorney. I've been working in privacy for about 15 years. And today we'll be talking with Sarah Statz, the Chief Cybersecurity Counsel at American Express, about how to get the privacy tools your team needs. So a few quick housekeeping things. If you have any questions, please enter them into the question box in the Zoom Q&A panel. We'll attempt to work them in as we can, but we'll also save some time at the end to answer questions. So without further ado, let's get started here. Sarah, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. And thanks for having me today, Andy. I'm happy to be here to discuss this important topic with you. I'm the Chief Cybersecurity Counsel at American Express, and me and my team are responsible for all matters related to cybersecurity, incident response, and third-party risk at the company. And I've been with Amex for a little over 6 years.
Well, thank you so much for joining.
Sure.
So let's get going. So, you know, in the news today, we like GDPR and CCPA and CPRA, that kind of tends to make the most headlines, but, you know, all of us that have been doing this for a while, you know, really we see new regulations happening all the time. Every year we get more, and we're also seeing this trend that the potential penalties for not complying with these new regulations is getting higher and higher based on percentages of revenue, and the response times for incidents are getting faster and faster. So first question, just wanted to start off with you here, Sarah, was, you know, how do these continual waves of additional regulations impact the way companies operate?
Yeah, I mean, it really adds a lot of complexity to your incident response process. Even just looking at one market like the United States, there are 53 different state and territory notification requirements. And in the last few years, we've seen additional state regulators, including financial and insurance regulators, add another layer of notification requirements in addition to the traditional state data breach notification laws. In some cases, in just one state, you might have to notify a number of different regulators. In New York, for example, you have to notify 3 different state agencies under the state data breach notification law. And if regulated by the New York Department of Financial Services, or NYDFS, you'd also have to notify the NYDFS within 72 hours. And even, you know, once you kind of establish who you have to notify, notifying can be complicated in itself. Most states have their own, you know, method for filing notices. So it may be that you have to submit your notice via a portal, through an email address, or even a letter. And some of these different mechanisms have very different content requirements. So as you start to multiply all of this across each state, this really is a patchwork of requirements, and it's challenging even for a seasoned practitioner to really get this right. And it's also, you know, alarming sometimes when you're dealing with a security team, when you have to tell them that you may have to do upwards of 40 to 60 notices to state agencies in the US. That can cause a lot of alarm to those teams who would naturally be nervous about that. And the state laws, you know, in the US generally follow a similar pattern in terms of requiring notice in the event there's a loss of certain data elements, mostly name plus some combination of other sensitive data or other data that could lead to account access. But states really do vary on what they consider a breach. And, you know, this is not the construct that's typically used in international markets. So that's another added layer of complexity if you have some sort of global incident where the standards outside the US are often largely based on potential harm to individuals. So for example, you know, under the GDPR, the potential harm, you have to assess the potential harm to the rights and freedoms of individuals. And there's a different sense of what constitutes sensitive data in other markets. And finally, I'll say, you know, adding to the complexity, the timing requirements around notification obligations are are tightening and changing pretty rapidly. Federal regulators in the US just passed a 36-hour notice requirement of material computer cybersecurity incident. The GDPR has a 72-hour notice requirement. The New York Department of Financial Services has a 72-hour notice requirement. So it's getting really complex, to say the least. And you definitely don't want to be thinking about all of this and trying to map all of this out for the first time in an actual incident.
Yeah, totally. And one thing that we've seen a lot of too is that because everybody's subject to all these different regulations and timelines, where that any kind of contract you have with another organization tends to try to take into account these regulations. And so there'll be, if there's a 72-hour notification timeline for GDPR, that the company may want 24 hours, so they have time in between. When you look at contracts involving the sharing of data, it is what do you kind of see as the standard expectations?
Yeah, it really does vary. So a lot of companies do take that approach where they'll want you to provide them notice so that the total time between the vendor providing notice is within that time frame of the regulatory expectation. So 24 hours notice of a security incident is not uncommon. In a lot of cases, you see requests for immediate notification or prompt notification. It really runs the gamut depending on which company you're dealing with. But it is getting increasingly short, I'll tell you that.
Yes, definitely. So, kind of stepping back for a moment and just looking at some of the kind of bigger picture of incident response. We talk to a lot of organizations, and really because of kind of how this space has evolved, really most organizations, incident response really starts as a purely security oriented activity. And so kind of activities here on the bottom of the slide, the incident happening, the forensics and remediation, sometimes, the technical teams may have just a pure focus on those aspects of the incident, and not really see all these long tail activities. But I know you've had experiences, across multiple different organizations, both from private practice and, working at American Express. What does that long tail tend to look like, in all these different places you've seen?
Yeah, it can be a really long tail. I think sometimes regulator inquiries can come in almost a year after an incident. And if you have any litigation stemming from a security incident, you can expect that to go on potentially for years. So record management is really key, and ensuring you have good litigation hold practices in place in your incident response plan is really important, so that you're able to respond later. What you tend to see is, there's like a crush of the response, and the technical piece and the understanding what happened and getting all of your notifications out and handling kind of the emergency situation. It can be really challenging that once all of that adrenaline and emergency kind of wears off, you actually can have a hard time getting people within the organization to have a continued focus on these remediation efforts and the longer term potential lessons learned. So it's really important to kind of ensure that your teams stay focused on learning and getting better for the potential next incident. Cyber practitioners always say, don't let a good cybersecurity incident go to waste. It's a good time to, make a lot of changes at your company, potentially, depending on how it went. And there's always room for improvement following an incident like that.
Yeah. Now, what would you say, sometimes we people in an organization would say, this is all like scary stuff. I'd just rather not think about it. We'll just plan when something happens, we'll call outside counsel or we'll call our cyber insurance provider and, just let them figure it out. Just because I don't want to think about it. What would you say to someone that kind of has that mentality when it comes to incident response?
Yeah, I mean, it can be easy to shy away from it because it feels like a really big and unknown issue to tackle, but honestly, it doesn't work that way. You can have terrific outside counsel and that's great to have, but outside counsel needs the support from inside the company to help coordinate the response, identify the key stakeholders, and help identify issues that aren't immediately always, very apparent. And in terms of the cyber insurance carriers, that market is getting tougher, and a lot of those carriers will expect to see that you have plans in place and that you are prepared to respond to an incident. So you definitely don't want to be in a position, trying to get cyber insurance coverage and have that kind of, I guess it might be like a cavalier attitude of I'll deal with it when it comes up, or isn't that what we're paying you for? They definitely expect to see, they expect to see some internal work and a plan in place before even issuing cyber policies in a lot of cases. So, the thing to remember is these are crisis situations, and you don't really want to be thinking about these things for the first time. There's always really challenging and new issues to solve in every incident, and you can't plan for all of them, but you don't want to have to think through every piece of a response in the moment. And, it's frankly kind of a job losing moment if you haven't done anything and haven't put any effort into this. It's not a surprise to anyone. Cyber security issues are really prevalent. They're in the news every day. So it's not something you can hide from and hope for the best, unfortunately. I think you have to do it. You have to put the effort into being ready, and it'll pay spades in the actual event that something happens.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think when you're talking about the cyber insurance policies, we've started to see that more and more there's a higher and higher expectation, as you're saying, from insurers that they're not going to write a policy unless you have a very well, established program in place, that you're running tabletop exercises, that you're really showing that you take it seriously, because, from their perspective, if you're not, that's just going to drive up the cost quite a bit. What do you, when you look at like this whole process and, what it actually feels like to be in these incidents, what are the problems with taking a completely manual approach to doing this work?
It kind of gets back to the long tail. If you have a manual process, and what manual process to me sounds like Excel spreadsheets and email.
Yeah.
It, for better or worse, it's in those files. And since there's such a long tail on these things, I think in the moment, everyone thinks that they'll remember every piece of it and every action that they took. But the reality is that those records of what you did and how you made decisions and who was involved at the company are crucial to be able to answer questions down the road. And it also can be really helpful in helping you respond to future incidents, because you have materials and you have, some documented steps already in your process. And so, you really need to kind of think about that. If your process is to keep all this in email, people leave companies, and then it can be really hard to track down what exactly happened. And that's not the position that you want your company to be in, and trying to kind of recreate every step that you took along the way can be tough.
Yeah. Well, and as you say, like people leave company, you try to bring in new people, and sometimes just to be able to get them up to speed on what might have happened over the last 6 months can be a big challenge, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's tough for the new people too.
So yeah, just a quick background on the buyer's guide we put together and kind of the reasoning behind it. So we talked to a lot of GCs, privacy counsel, compliance teams, and one of the things that we've heard a lot is that historically, because the role involves like reading, writing, that sometimes the thought was, well, the legal team that they only need the office suite, just the Word document spreadsheets to do their work. Um, but I think we're seeing that things are changing now. I think there's more and more a sense of, wow, like there's so much work to be done, and there's so much automation technology that can be used. And I think actually I read in the recent IAPP governance study that the privacy spending is going up 30% year over year. So I think you are seeing that organizations are saying, okay, we should devote some more of our resources to doing this well. And so I think a lot of these teams are now looking at procuring technology kind of for the first time, and so that was really the motivation here, kind of helping people have a roadmap on what's the best way to do this. So we surveyed senior leadership across a bunch of Fortune 500 companies, high technology, high growth companies, to sort of put this together. And what it kind of comes down to are these best practices around how you build a business case, how do you get through the procurement process, and really how do you get the whole organization behind you when you want to make these purchases. So kind of starting with the first step here, building the business case. What do you think of, Sarah, as what constitutes a good business case? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, I think this guide, just to kind of take a step back, I think this guide is really helpful. It's not always a piece of the problem that in-house privacy professionals think about. And so I think it can be really a useful guide in kind of thinking ahead of how to get the technology that you need in order to, maybe not only respond to security incidents, but manage other privacy matters that you need to track. On the business case, it's almost like the business case makes itself in some way in light of all of the legal and regulatory activity in this area. Cybersecurity has been and really continues to be on the top list of items boards are worried about and what keeps general counsel awake at night. It really requires a cross collaboration with a multitude of teams to really want a program and want technology to help resolve some of the challenges that companies have with handling these issues. And so, I think a business case, it can really be helpful if you have that stakeholder engagement across the board and that buy-in that this really is needed at the company level, and that it's really kind of everyone's problem. It's not just technology's issue to solve. It's the legal department, it's compliance, it's the communications team, the marketing team, right? They're all key to this. And one good way to kind of start is to make sure everyone's on board and understands why this is such an important need.
That's a great point. And when people are looking at putting together maybe the raw numbers around stuff, what are the kind of factors that are good things to point to? Is it outside counsel spend, potential fines? Like what are people's time? What do you think are the most compelling things that people can kind of build in there that are things that they can quantify? Because I think that's always a challenge when you think about, oh yes, it's a very stressful problem, and I think like you said, people stay up at night thinking about it. But what are some of the ways to quantify this for people when they're building a business case?
Yeah. And unfortunately, I think a lot of times this will come after something has happened, right? So in a lot of contexts, we'll see companies trying to put in place better record keeping and management flows of security incidents and other processes after they've had some sort of regulator inquiry where it was really painful to piece that together. So, a little bit of this is often reactive. It's great if you're in the proactive position. And so I think in those cases, it's helpful to, use some of the things that you said, like how this would help with outside counsel spend, potentially, be able to demonstrate how these tools can help the company respond to inquiries. You can look and you can see, some of the recent regulatory findings and issues, particularly in Europe, with data protection authorities, fining companies for not notifying within 72 hours or not having appropriate documentation of managing security incidents and how those were handled and decided. And you can sometimes use what other companies have struggled through to demonstrate how important this is for your company to get on top of, so that you don't face the same kind of issues. So I think that if you're not in a reactive situation and you're in the proactive, which is very good, it can help to look at how other companies have done it wrong and show how you want to do it a different way. So that those are some of the ideas I would have on just, making a case and showing why it's so important to have this.
Yeah, we kind of have I guess, fortunately or unfortunately, there's this constant stream in the news of, okay, what was the latest company that went through some of this? So there, to your point, there's a lot of decisions you can point to and say, look, this is what happened to this organization because they didn't have it buttoned up as well as they could have.
Yeah, definitely. And you can even draw from other areas of crises that the company may deal with, right? A lot of times crisis management, it includes the same steps, right? Like you have to make sure all the stakeholders are engaged, and you have to stay coordinated on communications and up to date on the facts. These are things that are consistent across different types of crisis that a company may handle. And so you can also kind of shed some light from other issues that the companies had to deal with to help respond and help demonstrate why, in terms of cyber, this technology can be helpful in privacy.
Yeah, that's a great point. Kind of making analogies to things people have experienced before if they aren't specifically familiar with it.
Yeah.
So moving, kind of into the next step here, the procurement process. What, in your mind, what are sort of the key technology requirements you see in an incident response platform?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the true technology requirements of uptime and availability, accessibility by your employees, and kind of those are obviously very key from a technology and infrastructure perspective. On the more kind of choosing which product to use, I think ease of use is so key and can't be emphasized enough. If your teams can't use it or won't use it, or it's too hard, or there's so many clicks, or it's too challenging, it really won't work, and people just won't use it. And then you'll have the same problem of half the stuff's in an email, and some of the stuff is in your tool. So you want to make sure that the team can and will use it. And to the extent you can, do a demo, do more than a product demo where someone just walks you through it. Have access to it and make sure that your teams try it out in real life. It can make a huge difference. I think when you kind of watch someone who knows the platform really well click around and show you all the bells and whistles, that it doesn't always translate when you are trying to do it yourself or trying to get your teams to do it. So I think to the extent you can do a pilot or a temporary ability to actually use the functionality and see how it works. You want to have your key considerations, like what information do you want to be able to retain about each incident, and what stakeholders need to have access to it, and does it make sense for all of those users to have access to the platform, or is somebody kind of in charge of doing it? So you want to think through how these things work at your own company. And the privilege can be, the legal privilege can be part of that equation. Do you think that this system will work to help your company maintain privilege? Although it has been increasingly challenging through some of the recent decisions to prove privilege in the context of a security incident. But it's important to have thought about those things and how you want to set it up, so that in the event that you do want to claim privilege over certain parts of your record, you're able to do that. And you want to really think through what the steps are. Does the program have baked in steps to follow to prompt your team, or do they have to kind of remember to do everything themselves? Like, in the middle of a crisis, it's hard to remember the 52 things you're supposed to remember to do and think about. So it's great if those are kind of baked in, and you're not having to find your plan document and then look at the, if it's all in one place. I think that can be really helpful. You kind of want to show that it's a well-oiled machine, right? In terms of data collection and use. And you want to make sure that whatever product you end up using works for you, like truly works for you. So
right.
Whatever it takes, right? I think it's different for every company a little bit.
Yeah, a couple of things you said there. One, you're talking about how in a crisis it's so hard for people to think well sometimes. And I was talking to a chief privacy officer recently, and he said, anytime there's an incident going on, everybody's IQ drops 50 points. Just because it is stressful, I mean, it is, high stakes for the company, high stakes for people's jobs, and I think that sometimes really makes it hard for people to always think as clearly as they might on other circumstances. But it kind of leads to, I think, the other idea is when you're talking about, actually using the product with your teammates and, really building that muscle memory. It's kind of like why tabletops are so important for organizations. And, from a frequency of tabletops perspective, I think people talk about doing them in general. Do you think of like a regular cadence for your company when you do that, or is it like just as needed as things come up?
Yeah, I think I'm probably biased. I'm a cybersecurity lawyer, right? So
right.
As much practice as you can do, the better. You don't want to fatigue your stakeholders either, and then they're just kind of more complacent. Like, you do want the tabletop exercises or even the hands on the keyboard type exercises to feel really real and have that little bit of nervousness, right? And how to respond. I think a good kind of rule of thumb that I've seen over the course of my career is, at least making sure that you're practicing your plan once a year, particularly if your company has turnover in the core stakeholder areas. the prior employee may have known the plan perfectly and knew what to do, but now there's somebody new sitting in that seat, and you want to make sure that they're on board and know what their activities are. And in some way it kind of helps to just also show and demonstrate to these stakeholders that you do have a plan and that you follow the plan, and take certain actions in a response, and that can kind of help with the IQ problem a little bit, because what you do see is different stakeholders will start raising everything and anything, right? And you're like, no, that's helpful, but it's also helpful if you kind of stay on task and do the steps that are required for your particular role in this response. And so I think practicing it and demonstrating that you've got the right people around the table who think across the broad range of issues that you need to think about in a response can really help kind of with coordination and kind of streamlining your response efforts in the end.
Yeah, totally. I think you raise a good point about, like, if you have, the real problem every business faces is that people don't stay at companies for very many years. And so you have a lot of change. And so if one person created that incident response plan and it's in a static document that only gets looked at, whenever that person created it, it's really not going to do you much good if that person's gone, or
Right.
when the regulations are completely shifted or the contracts are all different. It can be a moving target.
Absolutely. Yeah, you need to at least look at your plan periodically, and best practice is to actually practice it.
Yes, great. So the other big important part of the process that came out of our survey was just how really important it is to get cross-functional buy-in across the different aspects of the business. Could you talk a little bit about that? Who are the key stakeholders when you're looking to make this kind of purchase?
Yeah, I think a lot of them are really listed here. I would include the communications team as a key role as well. It's critically important that all of these stakeholder groups are on board. No one team can manage this process end to end fully. And so you need to have that rounded stakeholder engagement. And that can really help with, as we kind of talked about before, it can help kind of build up the business case for this. And it's no one unit's issue. I think, years ago, it was probably viewed as a technology issue, right, to solve and manage. There's certainly core to the function in terms of responding and to the actual issue and taking steps to prevent recurrence or stop the issue. But now so many other stakeholders, because of the legal and regulatory and just environment that we're in, there's a lot of other key players across the company that need to be involved. And I think, the legal department definitely plays a role in thinking through how you want to record facts about your incidents, what your record management policies are, how to think about privilege, and how you might want to try to set up your incident response to protect as much as you can under privilege or what's appropriate. And so, I would say that they're pretty important, but one stakeholder isn't going to be able to do it all themselves. So yeah. I think it's really key to bring them all in and make sure that the solution that you're thinking about works for them. Different teams will have different reporting requirements too, and that can be a key piece of the technology that you buy. Because you'll want to be able to look across the security incidents that your company has had over time And although they may be small incidents, right, that didn't have a huge ramification, you want to be able to identify if there are measures or things that you should be putting in place to prevent that sort of incident. And so really the only way to do that in a lot of cases is to have kind of a reporting functionality and to be able to look across all your incidents. Maybe it's a particular business unit that keeps having a problem, right? So like more training or more controls there. So I think those can be really important pieces, and the other stakeholders will have their own kind of requirements in terms of what they'll want to see.
Yeah. Well, if you look at kind of each of these different stakeholders, like you mentioned, communications is one. What kind of tailored message would you provide to, or would you kind of pitch to the communications team to like get their buy-in on being a supporter of bringing in this kind of technology?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I see that the communications team is often involved in is, if you've had to publicly disclose your incident, and you're getting media attention, and you're having to respond to those, or you're having to respond to third parties, or maybe even notifying them proactively, right?
Right.
A lot of that will involve your communications team, and they may want the ability to store the messages, like the kind of final, like these are the messages that are the most accurate as of X date, and we'll use these if we get an inquiry. That may be kind of their view of what their requirement is in terms of making sure the teams are coordinated and people aren't using an old statement that was yesterday's facts. And, you have to make sure that you have the most current, so that the tool could possibly help them with that and understanding, how they manage those kinds of requests and how they make sure that they're responding with the most accurate information at any given time. That's how you'll discover and uncover how these teams work and what they need to see, and the solution maybe can accommodate that.
Right. When it's so critical for the business that everybody be on the same page, because whatever public statements that either the communications is making in a very tactical way versus anybody else in the business might get asked about an incident, for them to be on the same page, is vitally important, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's where you've seen a lot of security incidents kind of go wrong, right? Like the company will come out and say it was only X number impacted, and then 3 days later it's like, oops, it was actually 10 times that amount, right? So those are the kinds of things that you want to avoid, and making sure that you're really coordinated across your teams to make sure that information is the most current and accurate, that this is the major coordination function.
Yeah. One aspect of this, I think, that I found it is that sometimes the business units themselves don't realize how involved they'll have to be when this stuff happens. And can you speak a little bit to that, and how, I think especially if they're like a revenue generating part of the business, and then all of a sudden this becomes a major part of their workload, can cause a lot of frustration. But maybe speak a little bit to how critical the business units are whenever you're managing incidents, as they have those customer relationships.
Yeah, the business is key. They can really help spot issues that wouldn't be readily apparent, right? If you're let's say you're launching a new product in 3 days, and the security team may not know about that, right? And what's your messaging around that new product? And should you hold on launching that product, or should you change, make sure the messaging is in line with messaging that you're giving in terms of the security incident that the company's handling. And so, the business can really kind of orient the teams to what the true impact is. And what the impact to customers will be. And a lot of times they'll have insights into who will be coming to the company to ask for more information, right? From clients to different customers. They may want to manage some of their relationships with a higher touch and do a reach out to certain clients if they're concerned about the incident. And so the business teams really are important in terms of helping the response team think through and really understand the impact to the company's clients and customers or other impacts that may not be clear on the face. So
yeah, it's such a good point. But there's so many other things going on in the business. Like sometimes, maybe you're about to have a big quarterly earnings report that's about to go out, and thinking about how that fits with the timing of any, regulatory notification requirements you have. And or if you're a startup and you're about to raise another big round of funding, like the timing of when those kind of announcements happen can have a really huge effect.
Yeah, and you don't want your business teams caught flat-footed either. If you've got your compliance or privacy teams sending out consumer notices to your customers and the business isn't fully aware, those customers, they may call the number that you list on the communication, right? But they oftentimes will pick up the phone and call their business contact.
Yeah.
And you want to make sure that the business teams are equally prepared to respond or direct those communications. The worst thing that can happen is if a client calls their business contact and the business contact has no idea, that you've communicated about a security incident. That can be a tough relationship issue. So you don't want to leave the business out.
Yeah. Okay. Great point. So, what, maybe speak a little bit to the benefits of once you've gone through this process and you've, built out the business case and you've gone through procurement, and you've got all this cross-functional buy-in. What are the longer term benefits of having done that and gone through that whole process?
Yeah, I think this is pretty clear on this slide. In addition to kind of the records retention piece, which is really key from a legal perspective to be able to respond to questions that may come in long after you've dealt with the incident. These tools can really help make sure that your teams are very coordinated. And, these are hair on fire kind of situations, right? No matter what, in a security incident, people are going to be nervous. That's just a natural piece of the process. And I have never seen a security incident where it wasn't a hair on fire type of issue. But at least you also don't have your house on fire in a way. If you have this technology in place and you have steps and everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing and it's clear up front, you can have your hair on fire, but the house is still there and you can still operate and just get people to do, what they're supposed to do. And it's all written or clearly in steps in front of them. So, kind of getting back to that, how people act in an emergency situation. When you think about other emergency situations, the directions and, have to be really clear to people, because there is that anxiety that's in the background of everyone's conscious. And so to the extent you can just make it the process and the steps everyone has to do as clear as possible, you're in a much better position.
Yeah, 100%. Totally agree. I think we've got a little bit of time for some additional Q&A here. It looks like one of the questions that came in, it says, one way they've been thinking about presenting the business case was how much they spend on outside counsel for even smaller routine incidents. So obviously every incident's different, but are there any rule of thumbs for how you can kind of quantify what that looks like for small and medium incidents?
I mean, sometimes you could use, what you've historically spent, right? And, if you're, especially if you're having to send and work with outside counsel on smaller incidents that, really don't have as big of an impact, and you think you could take those in-house, and I think that's, you can kind of look back over your incidents. If it's a big one and you really need the manpower and you need, a privileged investigation set up, outside counsel is needed, but maybe they're not needed in every single scenario, just to look up the state law that might be implicated, right? Like
Right.
over time, you kind of see how these things work, and it's, if it's not so massive, I think you could demonstrate that these are things that could be managed by the privacy team and compliance team and legal team in terms of the notifications, in certain circumstances.
Right. Well, and even in those bigger situations too, where you do have outside counsel involved, by being well organized, not having to have say, hey, outside counsel, can you go review all of our contracts for us?
Everyone's favorite.
Yeah. And then I think to what you've talked about earlier, like not only does it save you money then, but it's also things that proactive preparation does to shorten the long tail. So, if that long tail gets longer and longer, the more of those obligations you're not ready to meet because you don't really know them until you're in the heat of an incident.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. The more organized you are and the more processes you already have set up internally, the less you have to ask somebody else to do.
Yeah. So another question that came in here, there's been a lot of news about this recent vulnerability that is expected to have pretty big worldwide impact. How do how do companies treat those, even if you don't necessarily have a specific evidence that you've had a breach, but you have this major thing that's happening across the country? Like, how important is it to have a process for how you go about kind of methodically treating it as an incident almost?
Yeah, they're closely related in a way, in terms of the steps that you have to take. The Apache vulnerability, similar to the SolarWinds vulnerability that we, everyone dealt with last year. While you may not have evidence that you have had a true security incident or someone has exploited those vulnerabilities or that you have a data breach, there's still a lot of steps that are similar in terms of communication. If you're a vendor to third parties, you will get a lot of inquiries from your customers and clients about what your process is and whether you've patched or if you're vulnerable to those vulnerabilities. And so you may get questions from regulators on whether or not you're patched or you have exposure to this. And you have to do some internal investigation to make sure that you weren't vulnerable, or I guess you are vulnerable, but you're not exposed, right? Like,
yeah, right.
And you have to, work on your mitigation and remediation efforts. So a lot of the same steps are there in dealing with these widespread vulnerabilities. And so, I think you can use a lot of the same processes, particularly like the communications processes that you've developed, how it's important for companies to kind of think ahead of time how they talk publicly about responding to vulnerabilities and how much information do you disclose to your clients that are asking you about it, because does that potentially expose you more, right, if you're too forthcoming? So there's a lot of similarities between the two, and I think you can really leverage a lot of your incident response processes in dealing with these widespread vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that's such a great point, because you can really, as we see, we had SolarWinds, now we have this Apache thing. Like, it's just, there's always going to be something, right? And having a really buttoned up process, not only for when you do directly get impacted, but when you can kind of show that you've spent the time and process to eliminate that it's not an issue for you, that can be really valuable when regulator comes knocking on the door later.
Absolutely. And your own process for reaching out to your own third parties, right? So it's like, it's like a snowballing effect of everyone asking everyone whether or not they're exposed, and then if they've taken remediation efforts. So it's like the questionnaires just start flying around like rampant following big announcements. And so you want to have some way to respond and do that in a coordinated way, and make sure that, again, it's similar to the incident where you want that to be centralized. You don't want people kind of ad-libbing, right? Because people don't always understand, and they may say, oh, we don't have that, but you may have the vulnerability, but you haven't been exposed. So there's a lot of like nuance in how you might have to respond to something like that.
Right. One, I think you said this too, you're like, all the vendors you use, maybe your internal systems themselves don't have that vulnerability, but if you heavily rely on some vendors, you kind of need to know if they have any of those exposures too.
Exactly. Yeah. Third party supply chain risk it's
real.
real and challenging in these situations.
Yeah. So another question here, if you were to kind of put yourself back into the early days of the first handful of incidents that you were handling, what are some of the biggest lessons learned that have really carried through your career, that are things you wish you'd known that were hard learned lessons early days?
Yeah, I would say, kind of as sitting as outside counsel and helping small and large, highly regulated, not highly regulated, across the board kind of companies respond to these issues. It's such an interesting dynamic in dealing with these crises across different companies. And one of the things that I saw that really kind of influences how the response goes is almost a little bit of company culture. And it lessened if there was a plan and everybody knew what they were supposed to do. So you can reduce this problem. But if you get in a situation where everyone's kind of finger pointing or trying to demonstrate that it was someone else's fault, or you have teams that start writing documents saying like, oh, we noticed this a few years ago, but we didn't have the budget to fix it. Like, those are killers in an eventual litigation, right? And so, I think one of the things that was just really interesting in dealing with all of the incidents that I've dealt with over the years is in the companies that don't have that issue, where they kind of come together and are coordinated and are just trying to solve the issue and do the best response that they can, the response goes a lot better. And I think part of it is having a plan, and I can't harp on it enough, right? Like, if everyone just is kind of like, doing activities that they're aware that they would have to do, it kind of alleviates some of that potential for teams to kind of point fingers across different teams, or people to not want to exactly tell you what happened because they're worried about their own job or whatever. I think that's a huge piece of the dynamic that you wouldn't necessarily think about in your response, but it's really important and can make a difference.
Yeah, it makes a difference, not only like just internally getting it done, but then when you think about the aftermath and the impact, both like publicly from customers' perspective and regulators, and what kind of intensity, scrutiny you get afterwards. It's like, what story are you going to tell that, you had something happen, everything went crazy, no one knew what to do, and we're just trying to figure it out as they go, or you had a very methodical process in place, everybody got gathered around together, collaborated, knocked out all of the requirements, in a really timely manner. Both regulators and customers, are just going to view that very differently.
Yeah. Yeah. At the end of the day, look, it is a crisis, and nothing ever goes perfectly, right? Because it's an uncontrolled thing. It's an unanticipated problem that is an emergency situation, but you want to have the tools and the teams to, at the end of the day, say you did your best, you put the company's best foot forward in responding to a crisis. And that's a much better position to be in than trying to blame other teams and not coming together in a coordinated way.
Yeah, really agree. Well, I think we're about out of time here. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today and all your insights. Always amazing to talk to you, and thank you for doing this. Everybody that's on the webinar today, thank you for joining, and hope everyone has happy holidays.
Thanks for having me, Andy.
All right, thanks.
Take care.